I work the night shift at Starbucks. There are strange rules to follow. I never wanted to work at Starbucks. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be spending my nights behind a register, making coffee for half-asleep customers or random drunks, I would have laughed. Back then, my life was completely different. I was in college, dreaming of a marketing career, had a girlfriend, and some sort of future. Now, I had nothing. Everything changed when my father died. He worked in construction and fell from the 5th floor of a building. His death turned our family's life upside down. My mother broke down. She stopped leaving the house and, eventually, even getting out of bed. Her eyes lost their light, and she stopped caring for herself. For a few months, I tried to juggle school and part-time jobs, but the debts kept piling up, the bills wouldn't stop, and eventually, I had no choice but to drop out of college. I spent months looking for work, but without a degree or experience, no one wanted to hire me. Then, by chance, I stumbled across an ad. Night shift worker needed. Starbucks. High pay, flexible hours. Too good to be true. But I had no choice. The Starbucks was in the old part of town, slightly off the main streets. I never would have noticed it if not for the ad. It looked normal enough, though a little run-down. The sign above the entrance flickered as if there was a wiring issue, and the glass doors had a faint layer of dust. Through the murky glass, I could see the tables inside, most of them empty. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt stale, like the place hadn't been aired out in months. I was greeted by the manager, Mr. Hayward. A thin man in his 50s, wearing a spotless white shirt and an unnervingly wide smile. He shook my hand for too long, as if testing me. His eyes were cold, and his fingers felt dry and stiff, like the hand of a dead fish.
"Welcome to the team, Nick,"
he said, smiling, but his eyes remained emotionless.
"I'm sure you're going to like it here."
I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just signed a contract without realizing it. At first glance, it was just a regular Starbucks. But the longer I looked, the more strange details I noticed. The counter, the coffee machines, the syrups, the pastries, it all seemed normal. But in the corner stood an old vending machine that hadn't worked in years. Its screen flickered as if it was trying to display something but couldn't. A clock hung on the wall. At first glance, it seemed fine, but if you watched closely, the second hand moved in short, jerky motions, as if something was holding it back. The mirrors reflected the store, but with an almost imperceptible distortion. I tried to catch the oddity in the reflection, but every time I turned my head, everything looked normal again. Behind the counter were the staff rooms. Break room. A tiny space with lockers, an old armchair, and a TV that never turned on. Storage room. The air smelled of coffee beans and cardboard. Shelves lined with syrup bottles and large boxes. At the far end, another door, which, according to the manager, led to nothing important. Cold air seeped from beneath it. The freezer. Huge metal doors, always radiating an icy chill, as if they led to the Arctic itself. On the surface, everything seemed ordinary, but the cafe carried a strange weariness. If buildings could talk, this one would whisper something dark and unsettling. Before leaving me alone, Mr. Hayward gave me one last piece of advice.
"Oh, and one more thing, Nick. There are rules for the night shift. They're posted in the break room. Follow them."
I waited for an explanation, but he just smiled and walked away. In the break room, a single sheet of paper was taped to the wall. The text was printed, clear, and concise. 1. If you're alone in the cafe after 1 a.m., do not enter the storage room, even if you hear knocking from inside. 2. If a silent customer with no face walks in, just make a double espresso and give it to them. Do not speak to them. 3. If someone calls your name from the break room, do not answer. After midnight, no one is supposed to be in there. 4. Do not open the freezer between 1 o'clock and 4 a.m. 5. If someone asks, "What time is it?" do not answer directly. Just point to the clock on the wall. I read the list over and over. Was this a joke? Some stupid prank? But something in my gut told me there was truth in those rules. I just didn't know yet how terrifying that truth would be. I read the rules again. I reread the list of rules. The words seemed simple, but their meaning unsettled me. Was this some kind of prank? A corporate joke? Why hadn't the manager even tried to explain them? I was alone in the cafe, and with each passing minute, the silence grew heavier. It felt like the place had a life of its own, and I was just an uninvited guest. At 1:30 a.m., I heard knocking. It was coming from the storage room. I froze. For a moment, I stood completely still, listening. That didn't make sense. There was no one else here. Maybe another employee had forgotten something and was trying to get back in. I took a step toward the storage room, but then I remembered the rule. Do not enter, even if you hear knocking. I stopped. My heart pounded in my chest. The doorknob turned, slowly. A chill ran through me. The door was still locked, but someone, or something, was trying to open it from the other side. I swallowed the lump in my throat and took a step back. The knob twisted again. I could see it moving, as if controlled by an unseen hand. Then, silence. Absolute stillness. As if nothing had happened. I clenched my fists and forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe it was just my imagination. Or maybe the door mechanism was faulty. Either way, I wasn't going to break the rule. I turned back to work, trying to push the incident from my mind. But not even 15 minutes had passed when I heard another sound. At 1:45 a.m., a scream came from the break room. Instinct took over. I rushed toward the door but stopped just in time.
Help me!
The voice screamed.
They've got me!
I froze. It was Mr. Hayward's voice. That was impossible. He had left hours ago. My heart pounded wildly. I listened. The voice sounded distant, muffled, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the room. Then, it changed, becoming weaker, almost whimpering.
Please! I can't get out! They're cutting me!
A shiver ran down my spine. My hand instinctively reached for the doorknob, but I stopped just in time. Do not respond if someone calls your name from the break room. I took a step back. In the moment I did, the voice fell silent. For a second, there was nothing but dead air. Then, from inside the break room, there was a soft metallic click, like a locker door shutting. But I knew. I knew there was no one inside. I stepped back again, realizing that this night shift was no ordinary job. Something else was happening here. And this was only the beginning. I tried to collect my thoughts after what had happened. The knocking from the storage room. The voice from the break room. It was all too strange to be a coincidence. But I forced myself to ignore it and continued my shift. At exactly 2 a.m., the cafe door opened. My head snapped up. A tall figure stood in the doorway, clad in a long dark coat. The visitor stepped forward, and a cold sweat broke out on my back. He had no face. His skin was perfectly smooth, no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a pale, featureless surface. A panicked urge rose in me to ask, "How can I help you?" But I bit my tongue. I knew the rule. Do not speak. My hands trembled as I started preparing a double espresso. I couldn't look away, though I felt an almost primal fear creeping up my spine. The visitor stood motionless, not moving, not breathing. I could feel his presence, as if he was absorbing all the sound in the room. When the coffee was ready, I carefully placed the cup on the counter and took a step back. The faceless man moved forward. He reached for the cup, and for a split second, I could have sworn his fingers didn't just touch the ceramic, they seemed to sink into it. He lifted the cup and brought it to the place where his mouth should have been. Suddenly, the lights in the cafe flickered. The old bulbs blinked rapidly, and in the next fraction of a second of darkness, he was gone. simply vanished. Like a shadow dissolving into the night. I stood behind the counter, barely breathing. The air felt heavier. The sense of unease lingered even after I rubbed my eyes multiple times, trying to convince myself that it had really happened. I glanced at the counter. The espresso cup was gone, along with him. That's when I realized I had just followed the rule. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel panic, I felt a faint, almost imperceptible relief. But I knew this wasn't over. I could still feel the cold fear clinging to me. I still felt the cold, clammy fear from my encounter with the faceless visitor. My fingers trembled as I wiped my damp palms on my apron and took a deep breath. I needed to get back to work, to focus on something else. The chime above the door rang as a new customer entered the cafe. My head snapped up. It was just an ordinary man, thin, wearing a dark jacket, his expression tired. He approached the counter and wordlessly pulled out his wallet. "Iced latte, please," he said, his voice low and slightly raspy. I nodded and mechanically turned to the espresso machine. Milk, coffee, foam, it all happened on autopilot. But when it came time to add the ice, I didn't check the clock. It didn't even cross my mind that I should. I walked toward the freezer, grabbed the keys, and unlocked the door. A wave of frigid air struck my face, sending chills down my spine. Inside, there was a large wooden crate where the ice bags were stored. I bent down to grab one. And then, I noticed something was wrong. The ice inside the bags was too dark. There were deep red stains on the surface. A metallic scent hit my nose. My heart pounded faster. I reached for the nearest bag and pulled it into the light. Inside were human hands. Don't forget to subscribe, it's very important for the promotion of the channel and for the improvement of stories. Frozen, pale, with darkened nails. Some looked fresh, rings, tattoos, and scars still visible. Others had been stripped down to the bone, as if something had gnawed on them. Fingertips were chewed away, nails cracked or torn off. My breath hitched. I stumbled back, slipping slightly. As I tried to shut the crate, I noticed that some of the hands weren't even packed inside, they lay loose on the ice. One of them twitched. At that moment, the freezer door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Darkness swallowed me like a cold shroud. I heard something moving in the dark. The sound was soft, like something shifting over ice, gliding without a single footstep. At first, it seemed distant, but with each second, it drew closer. My breath hitched. Then, I felt it, something brushed against my leg. A faint touch, almost like a whisper of wind, but I knew this wasn't the wind. I lurched backward, knocking into something behind me. A dull thud echoed in the freezing chamber, then silence. I stood frozen, afraid to move, when I felt another touch. Cold, dry fingers traced over my wrist. Then more, on my neck. More still, they skittered across my arms, probing, exploring. I was paralyzed, my body shuddering uncontrollably. "Stay." The whisper came right beside my ear. It wasn't human, more like wind slipping through the cracks of an old house. I went rigid. Suddenly, something gripped my ankle. A hand. Frozen, solid, unyielding. I yanked my leg away, but the grip tightened. I was being pulled down. I thrashed forward, but another hand latched onto my elbow. Another clamped onto my shoulder. They were holding me, squeezing, refusing to let go. My heart pounded so violently I thought it would burst. Then, something sharp raked across my cheek. A sharp sting, followed by the warm trickle of blood sliding down my face. My breath hitched. I screamed. A cold, slimy touch grazed my ear, then my lips. I recoiled, but it persisted, testing, tasting. With every ounce of strength I had left, I hurled myself toward the door, slamming against it with my fists. I kicked. Once. Twice. 3 times. The door refused to budge. Panic consumed me. Summoning the last of my strength, I threw my shoulder against the door. It burst open. I collapsed onto the floor outside, barely able to stand. The cafe's warm lights blinded me. I gasped for air, shaking my head as if trying to shake off the nightmare I had just escaped. Behind me, the freezer door creaked. It hadn't fully closed. From the crack, a single frozen hand emerged, long, pale, nearly translucent. I froze. But the hand slowly withdrew back into the darkness. I exhaled shakily and turned toward the counter. The customer was still there. He was watching me. And then, slowly, very slowly, he smiled. I stared at the customer, frozen in fear. I stood there, locked in place, staring at the customer before me. His grin stretched unnaturally wide, his lips pulling back far beyond what should have been possible, revealing rows of yellow, sharp teeth stained with dried blood. His eyes were black, bottomless voids, like holes leading into nothingness. My back hit the counter. My legs refused to move. My heart pounded in my throat, my lungs felt like they were collapsing, I was drowning. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. That face had me ensnared, its grotesque expression hypnotizing in its sheer inhumanity. From the storage room, a loud banging erupted. Not just one hit, something or someone was pounding against the door with frenzied force, desperate to break through. Then, another noise, a slow, dragging whisper came from the break room. My name. It sounded familiar, yet twisted, like a distorted recording on a broken cassette. The voice was weak, suffocated, yet insistent. It wasn't just calling me, it was pleading, moaning, like it was trying to burrow into my mind. I froze. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the mirror on the wall ripple, as if its surface had turned to liquid. Something dark and blurry pressed through it, like a reflection seen through murky water. Suddenly, the lights flickered once, twice, then went out. I dove under the table, curling up, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying to convince myself that this was just a nightmare. That any moment, my alarm would go off, and I'd wake up safe in my bed. But that moment never came. I heard something heavy dragging across the floor. Footsteps. No, not quite footsteps, something more like a slithering shuffle. They stopped near the counter. I could feel something bending down toward me, its rancid, decayed breath brushing against my skin. I clenched my teeth, shut my eyes tight, trying not to breathe, trying not to make a sound. Darkness. Waiting. Eternity. And then, horror. Thick, dark drops began dripping from the ceiling. They hit the floor, pooling into slow, viscous puddles. At first, I thought it was water, but the metallic scent that filled the air told me otherwise. Blood. Something shuddered beside me. Soft, slick, warm, whatever it was too real. It slithered, its wet fingers scraping against the floor, leaving behind a sticky trail. I felt something thin and bristly brush against my knee. What was it? I didn't want to know. Then, something hot dripped onto my neck. I reached up, wet. When the lights flickered once more, I looked down at my fingers. Dark red. Almost black. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted upright, knocking over a chair as I stumbled into the corner of the room. But the floor had changed. It pulsed beneath me, soft and fleshy, as if I were stepping onto living tissue. From the walls, long, skeletal hands stretched out, their fingers curling in spasms, beckoning me closer. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked tight. The mirrors trembled, and from within them, shadowy figures emerged. They writhed, elongated, their gaping mouths stretching into endless voids. They moved without sound, yet I could feel them pulling me in, consuming me with their gaze. And then, light. I opened my eyes. It was morning. The cafe looked the same as always. The clock read 6 a.m. No monsters, no customers, no pounding at the doors. Everything appeared normal. But I knew something was wrong. I walked to the mirror and looked at my reflection. My face had changed. The skin around my mouth was tight, the corners pulling together, covered by a thin layer of pale flesh. My eyes were clouded over, a hazy film blurring my vision. Breathing felt harder. I looked down at my hands. Around my wrists, there were faint, dotted black lines, like surgical marks for amputation. I needed to warn the others. I grabbed my phone and started typing. Each letter took effort. My fingers felt numb, sluggish. My eyes burned, my vision blurred, and my mouth had almost sealed shut. A faint crack echoed from the mirror. I didn't want to look, but something forced me to. In the reflection, I saw myself. But my reflection no longer moved with me. It was smiling. The last words I managed to type before my phone slipped from my fingers. Breathing is getting harder. Vision fading. Mouth almost sealed shut. Think twice before breaking the rules. Friends, what do you think happened to the main character? Who were his clients? Write your opinion in the comments, like and subscribe to the channel.